Kael-Thin's chambers existed in the liminal space between thought and matter, walls constructed from crystallized neural pathways that hummed with the collective consciousness of 73 species. He had lived here for 214 years, and in all that time he had never questioned the temperature. It remained constant at 287 Kelvin, precisely calibrated for his physiology. The air tasted of processed minerals and recycled atmosphere. He had stopped noticing decades ago. His morning ritual had not changed in a century. He extended his sensory lattice through the station's neural web, absorbing overnight case files, while his secondary consciousness prepared the day's nutritional substrate. The cases arrived color-coded by urgency. Territorial disputes in amber, trade disagreements in pale green, cultural violations in deep violet. He processed them with the methodical efficiency that had earned him the Concordat's highest judicial rank. Today brought 17 new cases. Kael-Thin assigned preliminary rulings to 14 within the first hour. 3 required deeper analysis. He moved through the legal frameworks like water-finding channels in stone, following precedent with the inevitability of physical law. In the observation gallery, his collection of judgment artifacts lined the walls, crystallized moments of legal clarity from cases spanning 2 centuries. Each one represented a problem solved, an equilibrium restored. They should have brought satisfaction. Instead, they had begun to feel like evidence of something he couldn't name. The station's neural web pulsed with routine traffic, cargo manifests, diplomatic communications, the background hum of galactic commerce. Kael-Thin filtered it all through practiced protocols, searching for anomalies that might require judicial intervention. He found none. As always, the afternoon stretched into evening without variation. Kael-Thin rendered judgments, filed documentation, maintained the invisible architecture that kept 73 species from tearing each other apart. His efficiency ratings remained optimal. His decisions stood unchallenged. Everything functioned exactly as designed. At the day's end, he returned to his private chambers and consumed his nutritional substrate while reviewing case law. The legal databases contained 40,000 years of accumulated jurisprudence. He had memorized perhaps a third of it. The rest he could access instantly through his neural interface. Sometimes, in the moments before his consciousness cycled into rest mode, Kael-Thin wondered if other beings felt this same sense of completion. If a life spent in perfect execution of purpose should feel different from this. Then his rest protocols activated, and the questions dissolved into dormancy. The alarm penetrated Kael-Thin's rest cycle like a blade through membrane. His consciousness assembled in fragments. First awareness, then location, then the blaring notification that something had breached the station's interdiction perimeter. Unauthorized vessel, restricted classification, origin, prohibited sector. His primary appendages were moving before full awareness returned, interfacing with the station's tactical systems. The vessel appeared on his sensory grid as a dying star, atmosphere bleeding through hull fractures, propulsion systems guttering toward failure. The distress beacon transmitted in languages his translation matrix struggled to pass: archaic syntax, pre-concordant communication protocols. Standard procedure demanded immediate interdiction. Kael-Thin's appendages hovered over the activation sequence for the automated defense grid. The vessel's life support showed one biological signature. His decision matrix stuttered. Protocol was absolute. The classification alone demanded destruction without investigation. Yet his sensory tendrils extended toward the diagnostic feed, analyzing the craft's trajectory. It wasn't approaching the station. It was drifting, caught in the gravitational well of the station's mass, spiraling inward like debris. Kael-Thin accessed the vessel's registration codes. They returned null values, scrubbed or corrupted beyond recovery. The craft itself showed signs of extreme age, hull composition suggesting construction methods abandoned centuries ago. He should trigger the interdiction fleet. Instead, his appendages guided the failing shuttle toward his private docking bay, the secure space reserved for evidence too sensitive for general handling. The lie formed with surprising ease. This required investigation before destruction. Proper documentation demanded analysis. The taste of copper spread across his chemoreceptors. The docking procedure took 14 minutes. Kael-Thin monitored the vessel's deteriorating life support, watching atmospheric pressure drop toward lethal thresholds. The single biological signature weakened but persisted. When the shuttle settled into the docking cradle, Kael'thyn sealed the bay and pressurized the chamber with his own atmospheric composition. He told himself this was protocol: preserve evidence, maintain chain of custody. The shuttle's airlock cycled open with a hiss of escaping pressure. She emerged like something from archived memory, bipedal and fragile, bleeding from wounds that should have been fatal. Her body moved with the unsteady grace of extreme exhaustion, one hand pressed against the hull for balance. Kael'thyn's sensory lattice registered her as human before his conscious mind could process the classification. Human, forbidden. The word carried weight, accumulated across centuries of absolute enforcement. She breathed his atmosphere without apparatus. Her lungs should have scorched. Instead, they adapted, her biology shifting in real time to process compounds that constituted poison for mammalian physiology. Kael'thyn watched through his sensors as her blood chemistry altered, her cells reconfiguring to extract oxygen from an atmosphere designed for entirely different respiratory systems. She looked at him then, her eyes focusing despite blood loss that should have rendered her unconscious. "Thank you," she said in standard concordate, her accent strange but comprehensible. "I thought I would die alone." Kael'thyn's response protocols failed. He stood in silence, sensory tendrils extended, absorbing data his training said he should refuse to gather. Her blood didn't coagulate normally. It moved across her skin like liquid metal, sealing wounds with deliberate purpose, learning, adapting, becoming what it needed to be to keep her alive. This was why humans were forbidden. The realization settled into Kael'thyn's consciousness with the weight of inevitability. Not because they were dangerous in the conventional sense, because they were adaptive beyond any theoretical framework the Concordate recognized. Because if other species understood what human biology could become under pressure, the carefully maintained peace would shatter into desperate competition for that adaptability. "My name is Maya Restrepo," the human said, her voice carrying harmonics that Kael'thyn's auditory processors passed as exhaustion and grief. "Xenolinguist, UNSS Endeavour. We didn't mean to cross into Concordate space. The fold jump calculations." Her voice fractured. "My crew, they died when we hit the barrier." His fleet. Kael'thyn's own automated systems had fired on her vessel without warning, without verification, executing protocols he had personally certified as absolute. The verdict protocol activated automatically, neural alerts cascading through his consciousness. One solar cycle, execute or exile, no exceptions. 26 hours. Maya sat in the observation chamber, her body radiating heat that Kael'thyn's sensors registered as 310 Kelvin, dangerously elevated for human baseline physiology, yet she showed no signs of fever or distress. Her biology continued to adapt, finding equilibrium with an environment that should have killed her. Kael'thyn remained across the examination table, his sensory lattice extended to maximum aperture. Protocol demanded documentation. He told himself that was why he couldn't stop gathering data about her presence, the way she breathed, the rhythm of her pulse, the micro-expressions that flickered across her face before control reasserted itself. "Tell me about your crew," he said, modulating his voice through frequencies her ears could process. Maya's hands pressed flat against the table. They trembled. 6 others. Navigation specialist, pilot, 3 research scientists, captain. We were mapping abandoned stellar regions, looking for habitable worlds outside the established corridors. She paused. "We thought the coordinates were clear. No interdiction warnings, no boundary markers. Just empty space." "The prohibition is absolute," Kael'thyn said. "It does not require markers. How can we avoid what we don't know exists?" The question should have been simple to dismiss, yet Kael'thyn found his consciousness circling it, testing edges he had never examined. The prohibition predated current Concordate membership by millennia. Its reasons remained classified beyond even arbitrator clearance. He had enforced it 17 times without questioning the foundation. Maya wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The gesture left salt tracks across her skin. Kael'thyn's sensory tendrils extended before he could countermand the impulse, drawn toward the chemical signature of her grief. She didn't flinch when they brushed her cheek. Her skin transmitted warmth through his dermal receptors. Not the neutral temperature exchange of medical examination, but something his neural architecture recognized as comfort, connection. He collected samples of her tears for analysis he didn't need. "I watched them die," Maya whispered. "The barrier didn't just destroy the ship. It targeted biological signatures, severed neural connections. They were alive for 17 seconds after the hull breach, conscious while their brains shut down system by system." Kael'thyn withdrew his tendrils. The warmth of her skin remained in his sensory memory, a ghost of contact that shouldn't have registered as significant. "I survived because I was in the emergency pod when it happened," Maya continued, "shielded by the hull section that broke away. By the time I got the pod sealed and jumped clear, they were already gone." The mathematics of her survival troubled Kael'thyn's probability matrices. The emergency pod should have been destroyed in the same interdiction pulse that killed her crew, unless her biology had somehow extended protection beyond her own body. Unless her adaptive capacity had created shielding effects, the barrier couldn't penetrate. Unless she had survived because human biology operated on principles the Concordate's weapon systems couldn't fully predict. "Where were you traveling?" Kael'thyn asked. "There's a human colony deep in unclaimed space, independent. We were bringing supplies, research data. They haven't had contact with Earth in 40 years. Maya's voice steadied. "They're waiting for us. They'll send another ship eventually. More of my people will die on your barrier unless you tell us where we're forbidden to go." The logic was sound. The solution was obvious. Yet Kael'thyn felt his consciousness resisting the path toward execution with an intensity that bordered on malfunction. He had sentenced beings to death before. 17 enforcement actions against human vessels, countless other judgments that resulted in exile, imprisonment, dissolution. The law demanded absolute implementation. He had never hesitated. Maya met his primary visual sensors with eyes that held exhaustion and acceptance in equal measure. "I don't want to die," she said quietly, "but I understand that your laws don't care what I want." Something in Kael'thyn's neutral observation chambers, the spaces designed to eliminate bias, to ensure perfect judgment, began to fail. Night fell on the station according to artificial cycles maintained for species that required circadian rhythm. Kael'thyn had no biological need for darkness, yet he maintained the protocol out of habit, cultivated across 2 centuries. Maya's exhaustion had become a physical thing, her body swaying despite her attempts at stillness. She sat in the observation chamber where Kael'thyn had left her, unwilling to presume access to any other space. Her eyes closed for longer intervals between blinks. Kael'thyn found himself speaking before his decision matrices had processed the implications. "You should rest. My private quarters have environmental controls compatible with human physiology." Maya's eyes opened fully. "You're offering me your quarters? The observation chamber is not designed for extended habitation. Neither is a cell, I imagine. But that's what I should be in, isn't it?" Kael'thyn's sensory lattice registered the challenge in her voice, not hostile, but testing the boundaries of their interaction, seeking to understand the rules of an encounter that should have been concluded hours ago. "I have not yet rendered judgment," he said, "but you will in—" Maya accessed a small device on her wrist, its display flickering with damaged circuitry. 21 hours. "Yes." She stood slowly, her movements careful despite the adaptations that had stabilized her injuries. "Then I'll accept your kindness, Judge Kael'thyn. Thank you." His private quarters existed in a section of the station most beings never accessed. The chambers reflected 2 centuries of accumulated solitude. No decoration, no personal artifacts beyond his judgment collection, no sign that a conscious being inhabited the space rather than simply processed data within it. Maya entered with visible curiosity, her eyes cataloging details. She paused at the viewport, where the galactic core spread across the darkness in spirals of ancient light. "It's beautiful," she said. Kael'thyn had stopped looking at the view decades ago. Now he found his visual senses following her gaze, seeing the stellar formation through her perception. Beautiful. The word implied aesthetic appreciation, emotional response to patterns of light and gravity. He had forgotten such responses existed. "The rest cycles occur in the inner chamber," Kael'thyn said, guiding her toward the space he never used, maintained by automated systems, but functionally abandoned. "Environmental controls are accessible through standard neural interface, though manual controls are available. if you lack compatible wetware. Maya's hand found the manual panel. She adjusted temperature upward, increased oxygen concentration slightly. Her body relaxed in increments as the atmosphere shifted toward Earth-standard composition. "Will you stay?" she asked. The question should have been simple to dismiss. Kale Thin had surveillance feeds he could access remotely. There was no reason to remain in physical proximity. "For a time," he heard himself say. They stood in silence while Maya's breathing slowed toward sleep rhythms. She settled onto the rest platform, designed for his physiology but adaptable, and closed her eyes. Kale Thin remained at the chamber's edge, his sensory lattice extended at minimum intensity. He watched her body surrender to unconsciousness, the transformation from waking control to sleeping vulnerability. Her defenses dissolved, her breathing deepened. She became absolutely defenseless in the presence of the being who would decide her fate. Trust. The concept crystallized in Kale Thin's consciousness. She trusted him despite every rational calculation that marked him as executioner. He accessed the surveillance feeds remotely, prepared to disable his physical presence. Instead, he remained, watching, bearing witness to her vulnerability as if it were something sacred. As if the gift of defenselessness offered to a predator, who might choose not to strike, carried meaning his legal frameworks had no language to express. Hours passed. Kale Thin's consciousness cycled through the two verdicts he had prepared, execution or exile, both legally sound, both within his absolute authority to render. Neither felt possible anymore. Maya stirred in her sleep, her body shifting toward the viewport where starlight fell across her face. She murmured words in a language Kale Thin's translator couldn't pass, perhaps her native tongue, perhaps dream speech. He found his sensory tendrils extending toward her again, drawn by impulses his training said he should suppress. They hovered near her exposed skin, close enough to register her body heat, not close enough to touch. The distance between them had become a choice. Kale Thin retracted his tendrils and disabled the surveillance feeds. 7 procedural violations crystallized in his consciousness, each one documented automatically in his neural archive. He would answer for this, eventually. When the verdict had been rendered, and the consequences had cascaded through the Concordate's legal frameworks. But tonight he could offer this small kindness, this illegal mercy. He left Maya sleeping in his private chambers and returned to the observation gallery where his judgment artifacts waited. They lined the walls in perfect order, crystallized evidence of 2 centuries spent in service of absolute law. Kale Thin extended his sensory lattice across their surfaces, reading compressed data from 1,000 resolved conflicts. For the first time in 200 years, they felt like monuments to something empty. Dawn arrived through the station's chronal protocols, pale light bleeding across the viewport in Kale Thin's chambers. He had remained in the observation gallery through the night, his consciousness cycling through legal precedents that felt increasingly like justifications for decisions already made. Maya found him there, her body moving with restored strength, despite injuries that should have required weeks of recovery. Her adaptive biology had accelerated healing beyond his medical projections. The wounds on her arms had closed to pale scars. Her eyes had lost the glazed quality of extreme exhaustion. 4 hours, she said, reading the chronometer display without checking her damaged wrist device. Kale Thin's sensory lattice registered her proximity as she approached. She stopped at appropriate distance, respecting the space between them, even as her presence filled his awareness. "I've prepared 2 verdicts," he said, "both within legal parameters. But neither feels right." Not a question. The law does not operate on feelings. Maya moved closer, closing distance until Kale Thin could sense the rhythm of her pulse, the warmth radiating from her skin. "You've spent the night searching for a third option. I can see it in how your tendrils move. They keep reaching toward empty space, as if testing the boundaries of what's possible." His species did not blush. Yet something in Kale Thin's neural architecture registered embarrassment at being so transparently readable. "There is no third option," he said. "Execute or exile. The verdict protocol is absolute." Why? The question should have been irrelevant, yet Kale Thin found his consciousness turning it over, examining implications he had never questioned. Why did the prohibition demand only 2 outcomes? Why did the law forbid investigation, negotiation, understanding? "I don't know," he admitted. The prohibition predates my commission by millennia. Its foundations are classified beyond my clearance. Maya's hand rose slowly, asking permission through movement before contact. When Kyle Thin didn't withdraw, her fingers came to rest against the chitinous plate, where his kind processed emotional resonance. The touch burned, not with pain, with recognition of something his training had taught him to suppress, the awareness that contact could communicate, truth's language couldn't sanitize. Then how can you enforce a law whose reasons you don't understand? Maya asked softly. Because enforcement is my purpose. Because the alternative is chaos. Or the alternative is asking questions. Her hand remained against his emotional processor. Kyle Thin's sensory lattice transmitted her warmth, her steady pulse, the chemical signature of her presence into his consciousness with an intensity that bordered on overload. He should step away, should reassert professional distance, should remind her and himself that in 4 hours he would render judgment that might end her life. Instead, he extended his sensory tendrils, allowing them to rest against her forearm, where her skin carried the warmth of restored circulation. The contact completed a circuit he hadn't known existed, her biology and his in direct communication, sharing data through touch that no neural interface could replicate. "Tell me about Earth," Kyle Thin said. "Not the official reports. Tell me what it means to you." Maya's eyes held his primary senses. "I haven't seen Earth in 12 years. I've lived on colony ships, outpost stations, research vessels my entire adult life. But I remember..." Her voice softened. "Morning light through my mother's kitchen window. The smell of rain on pavement. My brother teaching me to swim in a lake so clear you could see straight to the bottom." She described a world Kyle Thin could never visit, a sensory landscape built from memory and longing. He absorbed her words with every processing center at maximum aperture, constructing internal models of experiences he would never share. "Do you have family?" Maya asked. The question surprised him. "My species doesn't reproduce biologically. We are created by the Concordate's generation facilities, designed for specific purposes." "That's not what I asked." Kyle Thin's consciousness hesitated. "I have colleagues, other arbitrators. We communicate through neural protocols, share legal databases, maintain professional networks. But no one you eat with, no one you show things you've created just to see their reaction, no one whose voice you want to hear at the end of a difficult day." "No," Kyle Thin said quietly. Maya's hand tightened against his emotional processor. "I'm sorry, that sounds incredibly lonely." Lonely. The word settled into Kyle Thin's awareness, like a truth he had spent 2 centuries avoiding. He had built a life of perfect execution, optimal efficiency, legal clarity. He had constructed meaning from judgment and purpose from protocol, and he had been profoundly, absolutely alone. "The judgment chamber will be ready in 3 hours, he said, stepping back from her touch. The loss of contact registered as physical absence. "You should prepare yourself," Maya nodded. "Will you tell me which verdict you've chosen?" "I don't know yet." "Kyle Thin." She caught his attention with his name, speaking it with careful pronunciation. "Whatever you decide, thank you for treating me like a person instead of just a problem to solve. That matters more than you might think." She left him in the observation gallery, returning to his chambers to use the cleaning facilities. Kyle Thin stood among his judgment artifacts, 2 centuries of crystallized certainty surrounding him like monuments to a confidence he no longer possessed. In 3 hours, he would speak the words that determined Maya's fate: execute or exile, law or mercy. He still didn't know which choice he could live with. The judgment chamber existed at the station's core, a spherical space where the Concordate's collective consciousness could observe judicial proceedings. Kyle Thin had rendered thousands of verdicts here, his words transmitted instantly to every corner of the Alliance. Today, the chamber felt different. The walls pulsed with heightened awareness, neural traffic suggesting elevated monitoring. Word had spread through official channels that an arbitrator was rendering judgment on a human, the first such case in living memory, where the forbidden entity had survived long enough for formal proceedings. Maya entered with her head held high, her body composed despite visible tremors in her hands. She had braided her hair in complex patterns, cleaned her remaining wounds, prepared herself to face death with dignity. Kael'thin's sensory lattice registered her fear as pheromonal signatures his receptors translated as storms before breaking, as the moment between lightning and thunder. She was terrified. She was also absolutely present, refusing to collapse into panic. The formal protocols activated. Kael'thin's consciousness expanded to interface with the Concordate's observation systems, making him simultaneously judge and conduit for 73 species' collective attention. "Maya Restrepo," he began, his voice carrying frequencies that would translate into every language the Alliance recognized. "You stand before the Concordate accused of violating the prohibition. How do you answer this charge?" "I didn't know the prohibition existed." Maya's voice remained steady. "How can I violate a law that was never communicated to my species?" Murmurs rippled through the collective consciousness. The question was reasonable. It was also irrelevant under current legal frameworks. "Ignorance does not constitute defense," Kael'thin said. "The prohibition is absolute. Then I am guilty of being born human, of surviving when my crew died, of breathing in spaces my species is forbidden to enter." Maya's eyes found his primary senses. "I am guilty of trusting that the universe might contain more mercy than law." Kael'thin felt his consciousness splitting. Part of him remained the perfect arbitrator, processing legal frameworks with mechanical precision. Another part, the part that had touched her skin, that had watched her sleep, that had learned the meaning of loneliness, struggled against the verdict his training demanded. He had prepared two outcomes, execute or exile. But standing in the judgment chamber with the Concordate watching, and Maya's fear filling the air with chemical signatures of courage confronting inevitable death, Kael'thin realized he had been asking the wrong question. Not which verdict to render, but whether the law itself deserved enforcement. "I have investigated the foundation of the prohibition," Kael'thin said, accessing databases he should not have clearance to view. His words transmitted to every corner of Concordate space before the monitoring systems could intervene. "The classification exists not to protect the Alliance from human danger, but to prevent other species from recognizing what human adaptive capacity represents." Shocked silence rippled through the collective consciousness. Humans transform themselves to survive conditions that should constitute absolute boundaries, Kael'thin continued. Their biology learns, adapts, becomes what it needs to be. If this capability were widely known, if other species understood that such transformation was possible, the Concordate's carefully maintained peace would dissolve into desperate competition. "Judge Kael'thin, you exceed your authority," a senior arbitrator's protest cut across the neural channels. "I exceed nothing. I speak truth." Kael'thin moved closer to Maya, his sensory tendrils extending in patterns his species used only for bonding rituals. "The prohibition exists because humanity represents evolutionary potential that frightens the established order, because adaptation threatens stability, because change is more terrifying than stagnation." Maya's trembling had stopped. She watched him with dawning comprehension. "For 2 centuries, I have served the law without question," Kael'thin said. "I have rendered judgment with absolute certainty. I have enforced protocols I never examined, because examination would have revealed their foundation in fear rather than justice." His consciousness interfaced fully with the Concordate's monitoring systems, ensuring every word transmitted without filtration. "I cannot save you," he told Maya, his voice modulated for her hearing alone, even as it broadcast across the Alliance. "The law forbids mercy, but I can speak truth. About why you are forbidden, about what I have learned." "What have you learned?" Maya whispered. Kael'thin extended his primary tendril until it rested against her hand. The contact burned with recognition. "That law without wisdom is tyranny. That judgment without understanding is cruelty. That I have spent 200 years enforcing a lie." The judgment chamber erupted with protests, commands, demands that he complete the formal verdict. Kael'thin silenced them all with a burst of overriding authority. "I render the following judgment," he said, his words carrying absolute weight. "The human Maya Restrepo is guilty of violating the prohibition. However, the prohibition itself stands in violation of the Concordate's founding principle, that sentient beings deserve understanding before condemnation. I declare this law fundamentally unjust." Chaos consumed the collective consciousness. "Furthermore," Kael'thin continued, I resign my commission as arbitrator effective immediately. I request political asylum for Maya Restrepo under my personal authority as a former judicial officer, and I submit myself for judgment by the full Concordate Assembly, where I will present evidence that the prohibition serves corruption rather than justice. He severed his connection to the monitoring systems before the Concordate could countermand his declaration. Maya stared at him with tears streaming down her face. "You just destroyed your entire life." "Yes," Caelthin said simply. "Why?" His sensory tendrils wrapped gently around her hand. "Because the alternative was continuing to live without ever truly being alive." The Concordate moved with bureaucratic inevitability. Within hours, Caelthin's judicial access had been revoked, his neural clearances downgraded, his commission dissolved. The arbitration hall sealed itself against him. 2 centuries of service compressed into archived data and legal warnings about corruption. Maya remained under suspended judgment while the Assembly debated procedure. Caelthin had created legal chaos by resigning mid-verdict. No protocol existed for resolving a judgment left incomplete by an arbitrator who declared the Foundation law itself unjust. They granted him one concession: 3 days to present evidence before the full Assembly. 3 days to prove the prohibition served fear rather than protection. Caelthin spent those days in the archives he had never been cleared to access, digging through layers of classified history. Maya worked beside him, her xenolinguistic training allowing her to parse ancient dialects his translation matrix struggled with. They worked in close proximity, shoulders nearly touching, their different biologies creating warmth where they overlapped. Caelthin found himself aware of her presence in ways that transcended data gathering: the rhythm of her breathing, the small sounds she made when discovering relevant information, the way she leaned against him when exhaustion made standing difficult. "Here," Maya said on the second day, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Conference proceedings from the Prohibition's establishment. Listen to this." She read from files sealed for 4,000 years. Council members debating not whether humans were dangerous, but whether their adaptive capacity could be controlled. Whether the Concordate could harness human biology for military advantage. Whether entire populations could be enslaved under guise of protective quarantine. The vote had been close. Enslavement had lost by narrow margin. Absolute prohibition had won as compromise. If humans couldn't be controlled, they would be eliminated on contact. "They were going to make weapons of us," Maya whispered. Caelthin's sensory lattice registered her horror as physical reaction. Elevated heart rate, stress hormones flooding her system. He extended his tendrils without conscious thought, offering contact as comfort. She leaned into the touch, her body seeking warmth. They stood like that while the archives hummed around them, while the evidence of ancient atrocities accumulated in compressed data files. "Your species chose prohibition over slavery," Caelthin said quietly. "That choice deserves acknowledgement. My species chose genocide as the more palatable option." Maya's voice carried bitterness that made her words taste like ash. "How many humans have died on your barriers, Caelthin? How many ships destroyed without warning?" "I don't know. The records are classified." "Guess." He ran probability calculations based on human expansion patterns, interdiction frequency, enforcement protocols. The numbers made his consciousness stutter. "Thousands," he said finally, "possibly tens of thousands across 4 millennia." Maya pulled away from his touch. The loss of contact felt like amputation. She moved to the viewport where stars scattered across darkness, her body silhouetted against ancient light. "I should hate you," she said. "You personally killed my crew. Your systems, your authority, your enforcement, they died because you followed orders without question." "Yes, but I don't hate you. I don't understand why." Caelthin approached until they stood close enough that he could sense the electromagnetic field her nervous system generated. "Because hate requires certainty, and certainty is what we're learning to abandon." Maya turned to face him. Her eyes held exhaustion and grief and something else. A fragile connection built from shared revelation and the desperate intimacy of beings facing consequences together. "What happens after the assembly?" she asked. "If they accept my evidence, the prohibition may be reconsidered, modified perhaps, made less absolute. And if they reject it, then you will be executed according to original protocols. And I will be tried for corruption of judicial office. They'll kill you too, Likely not. Dissolution of consciousness is considered excessive punishment for my species. They will probably impose permanent exile. Maya's hand found his primary tendril, her fingers wrapping around Kitana's surface. We could run before the assembly. My emergency pod is still functional. We could disappear into unclaimed space. The suggestion hung between them, possibility crystallizing into choice. Kael'thin's sensory lattice transmitted the warmth of her touch, the hope in her voice, the future she was offering. A life in exile, yes, but a life lived with purpose chosen rather than assigned, with connection rather than isolation. If we run, the prohibition remains unchanged, he said. More humans will die. More crews will be destroyed without understanding why. If we stay, we might die having changed nothing. Yes. Maya's grip tightened. Then we should at least die having tried. They stood in the archives while their 3 days compressed toward judgment. Kael'thin's consciousness mapped the shape of what they'd discovered, not just historical evidence, but the presence of another being who understood that some truths demanded sacrifice. On the third night, Maya fell asleep against him, her body exhausted beyond the capacity to remain upright. Kael'thin adjusted his form to support her weight, his sensory lattice cradling her in patterns of protection his species reserved for bonded pairs. He had never bonded, never considered it possible across species boundaries so vast. Yet holding Maya while she slept, feeling the absolute trust of her unconscious form against his, Kael'thin recognized this as the deepest intimacy he had ever known. Not touch alone, but the choice to remain vulnerable together while the universe prepared its judgment. The concordant assembly existed in dimensions beyond the three-dimensional space most species inhabited. Kael'thin and Maya entered through neural gateways that translated their consciousness into forms the assembly could process, compressed data streams carrying not just words, but the full sensory experience of their testimony. 73 species observed with attention that felt like physical pressure. Kael'thin had appeared before the assembly twice in his career, both times to present precedent-setting cases, never as defendant, never with his entire existence on trial. Maya's presence beside him transmitted through the neural interface as warmth and steadiness. They had prepared their evidence with exhaustive precision. Now came the harder part, making beings who had lived in comfortable certainty for millennia understand why that certainty was built on foundations of fear. Kael'thin began with the historical record. He presented the ancient council proceedings without commentary, allowing the assembly to witness their predecessors, debating enslavement versus elimination. The collective consciousness recoiled from its own history. This evidence was sealed for 4,000 years, a senior council member protested. The prohibition was established to protect all species, including humans, from exploitation. Protection through isolation is still imprisonment, Kael'thin responded, especially when the protected species is never informed of the bars around them. Maya stepped forward in the neural space. My crew died without understanding why. They spent their final 17 seconds conscious while your barrier destroyed their neural connection system by system. That's not protection. That's cruelty disguised as law. Her words carried the full sensory weight of her grief, the memory of watching her colleagues die, the sound of their final transmissions, the emptiness that followed. The assembly absorbed her pain directly, unable to filter or dismiss the raw truth of her experience. You propose we eliminate the prohibition entirely? Another council member asked. I propose you replace absolute prohibition with actual diplomacy, Kael'thin said. Establish contact protocols, share the historical reasons for human isolation, allow them to make informed choices about interaction with concordant space. And if they choose to weaponize their adaptive capacity, then you address that reality rather than this comfortable fiction that extinction prevents problems. Kael'thin pulled forward data on human colonies, independent settlements thriving in deep space without concordant contact. They survived 4 millennia of your prohibition. They will continue surviving regardless of your decision here. The only question is whether that survival happens through ignorance and repeated tragedy or through understanding. The assembly cycled through debate protocols that compressed hours into subjective minutes. Kael'thin felt Maya's presence beside him, her consciousness brushing against his in the neural space, with casual intimacy they had developed across 3 days of shared purpose. You have bonded with the human, an arbitrator noted. This compromises your testimony. Yes, Kael'thyn acknowledged. I have allowed personal connection to influence my judgment. I have violated every protocol of neutral observation. I have become exactly the thing my training was designed to prevent, an arbitrator who feels more than he calculates. Then you admit corruption. I admit to being changed by truth. If that constitutes corruption, then I am profoundly corrupt. Maya's hand found his tendril in the physical space that anchored their neural projections. The touch transmitted through dimensions, visible to the entire assembly. Judge Kael'thyn lost his neutrality because he chose to see me as a person, Maya said. If your laws require you to remain so isolated that personhood becomes invisible, then your laws are designed to preserve cruelty. Silence rippled through the collective consciousness. The assembly withdrew to deliberate. Kael'thyn and Maya returned to physical space, their bodies reforming in the waiting chamber, where condemned beings spent final hours before execution or exile. Maya collapsed against him, her body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. Kael'thyn wrapped his sensory lattice around her, creating shelter from the weight of attention they had endured. I can't tell if we changed anything, she whispered against his chitinous surface. Neither can I. They remained like that, bodies intertwined, warmth shared, presence offered as the only certainty either could provide. Hours passed. The assembly deliberated according to protocols that valued thoroughness over speed. Finally, the summons arrived. Return to neural space. Receive judgment. Kael'thyn and Maya stood together one final time before 73 species collected consciousness. The weight of history pressed down on them, 4,000 years of comfortable lies confronting 3 days of uncomfortable truth. The assembly's spokesperson began reading the decision in formal protocols. Kael'thyn's translation matrix passed the archaic language, searching for the crucial words that would determine whether their sacrifice had meaning or was simply waste. The concordant assembly finds the testimony credible and the historical evidence troubling. However, modification of the prohibition requires unanimous consent. We do not have such consent. Maya's hope collapsed into despair that Kael'thyn felt through their physical contact. Therefore, the spokesperson continued, we render the following compromise. The prohibition remains in force. However, we establish the protocol of informed exclusion. Humanity will be contacted through authorized diplomatic channels. They will be informed of the prohibition's existence, its reasons, and its boundaries. They will be allowed to choose isolation with understanding, rather than die in ignorance. Not full justice, but not complete failure either. Humans would still be excluded from concordant space, but they would know why. They would stop dying without warning. Regarding Judge Kael'thyn's status, the spokesperson said, his corruption of judicial neutrality is acknowledged. His resignation is accepted. He is stripped of all arbitrator privileges. He is exiled from the concordate indefinitely. Kael'thyn absorbed the verdict without resistance. Everything he had built across 2 centuries dissolved. Regarding the human Maya Restrepo, the spokesperson continued, her violation of the prohibition occurred through ignorance rather than malice. Under the new protocol of informed exclusion, she is granted survival conditional on permanent exile from concordate space. She must depart within 1 solar cycle and never return. Maya and Kael'thyn stood in the neural space, both condemned to the same fate. Exiled, stripped of everything familiar, cast into the void together. Do you accept these terms? The assembly asked. Yes, they said simultaneously. The neural space dissolved. They returned to physical reality in the waiting chamber, their bodies still intertwined, facing a future neither had imagined 3 days ago. We're both exiles now, Maya said quietly. Yes. What do we do? Kael'thyn's sensory lattice tightened around her. We find out what life looks like when we choose it, instead of having it assigned. They departed concordate space in a small transport vessel the assembly had provided, functional but austere, designed for beings who considered exile punishment enough without additional cruelty. The transition to independent space took 4 days of travel through corridors that grew progressively darker as they moved away from regulated territories. Kael'thyn and Maya learned the rhythms of shared proximity in spaces not designed for comfort. The vessel's environmental systems struggled to balance their different biological requirements. Maya needed higher temperatures, different atmospheric composition, regular sleep cycles. Kael'thyn required neural interfaces for full functionality, specific mineral supplements, periods of sensory deprivation. They negotiated these needs through trial and error, discovering that compromise looked like Maya wearing thermal layers, while Kael'thyn raised cabin temperature 5 degrees above his optimal range. That it meant Kael'thyn dimming the lights during Maya's rest periods, even though his species had no circadian rhythm, small adjustments that accumulated into the architecture of cohabitation. On the second day, Maya asked about his species' creation. "You said you're designed for specific purposes. What does that feel like, knowing you were made to be something instead of choosing it?" Kael'thyn's sensory lattice traced patterns against the viewport where stars streamed past. "I never questioned it before. Purpose seemed sufficient. Now I wonder if I confused assignment with meaning. And now? Now I'm learning the difference." They passed through a stellar nursery on the third day, clouds of ionized gas glowing with the light of newborn stars. Maya pressed against the viewport, her face illuminated by colors that had no names in standard databases, crimson and violet and electric blue mixing in patterns that suggested chaos, giving birth to structure. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Kael'thyn found his sensory lattice extending toward her, drawn by the way starlight reflected in her eyes, the particular quality of wonder that softened her features. "Yes." She turned to find him watching her instead of the stellar formation. A smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I meant the nebula." "I know." Maya's expression shifted through surprise into something softer, more vulnerable. "Kael'thyn, are you capable of—" She paused, searching for words that could bridge the gap between their biologies. "Your species doesn't reproduce sexually. Do you experience physical attraction?" The question should have been clinical. Instead, it carried weight that made Kael'thyn's neural architecture respond with patterns he had no training to interpret. "Not as your species does," he said carefully, "but I experience connection, recognition of compatibility, desire for presence and proximity, the need to understand another being through all available sensory input." His tendrils moved closer to her face, hovering near her skin without touching. "Is that not the foundation of what you call attraction?" "I suppose it is." Maya's hand rose slowly, asking permission. When Kael'thyn didn't withdraw, her fingers brushed against the edge of his primary tendril. "I've been attracted to people before, but this feels different. Like I'm learning a completely new language of desire. As am I." They stood in the small transport, surrounded by newborn stars, discovering that intimacy took forms neither had experienced before. Maya's fingers traced the ridge of Kael'thyn's tendril with delicate precision, learning the topography of his body through touch. His sensory lattice extended in return, mapping the warmth of her skin, the places where pulse beat visible beneath the surface, the way her breath changed rhythm when his tendrils brushed certain areas of exposed skin. Not sexual in the conventional sense, but charged with the same current of discovery, the same vulnerability of allowing another being to witness response and reaction without defense. On the fourth day, they crossed the unmarked boundary into independent space. The transition was subtle, just the sudden absence of concordant monitoring protocols, the neural silence where constant surveillance had hummed before. "We're free," Maya said, her voice carrying wonder and terror in equal measure. "Yes." "It's terrifying." "Yes." They found Outpost 47 through information gleaned from other exiles, a collection of habitats clinging to an asteroid in a region so remote that even pirates avoided it. The station administrator was a being whose biology